Today we have with us Jeff Emmett from the Common Stacks team. You can follow him on Twitter at Jeff Emmett. That's JEFFEMMETT. Today we talked a little bit more about bonding curves, specifically augmented bonding curve, the generalized models of bonding curve, as well as the various token engineering and first principles models to think about when it comes to bonding curves. Welcome, Jeff. So I think DeFi is very interesting, but DeFi is also interesting in a way where everyone just goes to DeFi because there is returns to it. And I think whatever Common Stacks is doing, whatever like Giveth is doing, whatever we're talking about, all these different kind of systems, is so important because they are the basic architectural building blocks before this entire thing can boom. And right now, DeFi is booming, and I'm very, very happy for that because we need that kind of mass adoption. But I think we're not at that stage yet where we can just have everyone going to DeFi and forgetting to build the other tech stacks that we need in the system, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's one way of getting people's attention. I mean, I got to the crypto space because I heard, this Ethereum thing was blowing up, and I was like, what? And I started looking into it, and I was like, oh yeah, it's going up. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll get a bit. And then, and then I got interested, and then I started reading, and then I was like, oh wow, this can do a lot more than just, make you money. So I mean, it's getting people's attention, which is good. But yeah, I agree. The whole yield farming, borrow to lend to borrow to lend, doesn't seem to be a sustainable. And I mean, this is like it's the engineering consideration that doesn't factor into DeFi a lot of the time. Is we're building these modular components and they're all like stacking on top of each other. But if there's a critical failure down here, it's like a house of cards that all comes down. So it's really like everyone's building parts, but no one's considering synthesizing those parts into a whole and understanding the systemic effects or the systemic flaws that are built into some of these components. So it's still a risky space for sure, but it's great to see the enthusiasm and everything. It's just, I wish it was more for, social impact than it was for personal profits, but it's something.
Yeah, that's a good step towards the right direction. Not exactly at the end point that we're looking at, but it's okay. Getting there.
Yeah. Yep.
So the last time we spoke, you were telling me about augmented bonding curves, and I've seen like huge development in the space. So can you just do a quick intro on augmented bonding curves again?
Yeah, for sure. So, and I loved your recording about bonding curves yesterday. I think you did a great job going through all the various, types and design space. We look at this sort of like a architecture. There's a huge design space for bonding curves, and you can add, mechanisms for different use cases. And I don't think we've even identified, half of the use cases. Even today, the bonding curve is seen as a financial tool, which it is. It's kind of a transparent monetary policy tool. So you can, put in $1 and issue 4 tokens. So this is the grassroots economics community inclusion currency model, where they're working in rural villages in Kenya, where the problem that they have is a lack of liquidity. In rural villages, all of the fiat cash kind of gets siphoned back to the city via the leaky bucket problem. So what they've realized is if rather than giving fiat money in cash voucher assistance, which is kind of the gold standard of NGO aid, they issue a local currency. So the Red Cross puts $1 into the bonding curve contract, and 4 tokens come out, each worth $1. Actually, it's a Kenyan shilling, but we can call it $1 just to make it easier. And then those Kenyan shillings are, airdropped on a community. Well, not airdropped there. If you sign up, you get a sign up bonus. If you bring a friend, you get a bring a friend bonus. It's a lot of the same kind of, policies with signing on to any program. If you use it for 2 months, the chama gets another bonus. So you might get, $4 here, $3 there. And then you can transact in this local currency because importantly, all of the businesses, and the local chiefs accept this as currency. So it's not just a technical tool. It's not just here's a bunch of dollars, go use them. It's about the social acceptance of those dollars too. So working within the community and making sure that everyone agrees that this is a currency and it's not a currency, it's a token of value that they accept for flour or haircuts or anything that is needed. But the bonding curve really is an interesting tool because it's transparent to the community and transparent to the users what is behind it. And in our banking system today, that's often not the case. We have no idea what's backing our money, and that's fine as long as there's the trust that people will accept it. But when you're bootstrapping these ecosystems from the ground up, you kind of need to establish that trust, and having the collateral, transparent on-chain collateral through the bonding curve is really a good way to do that. So yeah, there's some really interesting developments going on in the bonding curve space. One of which I think almost no one is talking about is like they don't even have to be a financial tool. I had one researcher reach out from Australia saying, "Hey, could we use this, for example, to balance uploads and downloads in a torrent network?" So, there's free writing. If you talk about the tragedy of the commons, there's free writing all the time on the internet, right? If you want to download a torrent, I'll open my torrent thing, I'll download it, and then I'll close my torrent. So there's like people download, nobody uploads, right? So there's a few people who are super seeders. They upload all the time, and 90% of the network are just downloading, right? They're just taking, they're not giving back to this network. So what if you said, hey, we're going to implement a bonding curve that says you can only download X amount if you've uploaded Y amount, because you're now bonding those two variables in the system together, and you all of a sudden solve the free rider problem in a BitTorrent network without money. So you don't have to say, leechers pay seeders for their upload time, download time. You just say these two variables are now linked through a bonding curve, and you can only download X if you've uploaded Y. So I think there's so much use for bonding curves that you could go much beyond the financial use case. But we're still, in the early days of this, thinking, token goes in, token comes out, and the whole DeFi craze. This is like a way that we can, the new way to generate tokens. So I think there's a lot more out there than we've realized yet, and I think this is going to be a really important tool for a lot of things in the crypto space moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I was looking at DAICO, so
yeah,
DAICO, and DAICO and augmented bonding curve is almost quite similar. The only fact is that with DAICO you have a form of governance, whereas augmented bonding curve is 100% governance, 100% on-chain governance, and DAICO is a mix of both systems level governance plus human voting mechanism coming in.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. I have an article. I just put the rough draft out to our comms team. It should be coming out hopefully next week, talking about the augmented bonding curve as a tool for DAICOs. So DAICOs are sort of a more responsible ICO. I think that the terminology actually is like DAO plus ICO is a DAICO. So you have a token issuance mechanism, which in this case would be the bonding curve. And then you have it connected to a DAO where people can make decisions over how those funds are spent. So this is actually the difference between the augmented bonding curve and a typical bonding curve. Like the bare minimum bonding curve is just a collateral pool. So you put reserve into a smart contract, say DAI, and you get some token out. And that DAI is held in a collateral pool. And it could be 1-to-1, it could be 2-to-1, it could be 1-to-2. It doesn't it's how you set it up. The difference with the augmented bonding curve is you're creating another pool of funds. So you have the collateral pool, like every bonding curve, but you also have a funding pool. So when you put in DAI, say 50%, and again, this is the design space of the bonding curve. You can set it up however you like. 50% of the DAI goes into the reserve, and 50% of the DAI goes into the funding pool. Now, the funding pool can be governed, through conviction voting or through regular on-chain voting, however you see fit. And those funds can be used by a project. So now we have a way that investors can give a project money without the project founders just picking up the money and going to the Cayman Islands and no one ever hearing from them again, which is some of the problems we had in the 2017 ICO craze. Now we have sort of a more responsible, accountable fundraising system where some of the funds can go into collateral to give investors peace of mind. If they want to exit this token, there is always collateral. They can always exit. There's liquidity, just like Uniswap or Bancor offered today, but for that specific token. And there's also this funding pool. So the project's interests are aligned with the interests of the investors, with the interests of the users, because now there's sort of some oversight, some like agreement, explicit agreement that the project can use, 30% of the funds as long as they're going through the appropriate proposal system, et cetera. And then, the investors always have collateral to exit the token if they don't believe in what the team is doing. So it really helps to align the incentives, especially for small projects that don't have a lot of trading volume.
In that case, wouldn't the amount being put in will always be more than the amount taken out? Because then whenever I put money into the bonding curve, let's say 30% goes into the funding pool, so it'd be funding different projects. And the only way for me to take back the same amount that I put in is for these projects to generate, no, not even to generate some sort of return, for more people to come in. How then can we increase the amount of collaterals that goes into the bonding curve so that the bonding curve is not just increasing because people are coming in? And when we're funding these projects, how can we siphon some of the returns to go into the collaterals to be rewarding all these early investors in these collaterals?
Exactly. Yeah, so you're right. So as soon as you siphon a portion of those funds off into a funding pool, obviously you're under collateralized. So if everyone sold their tokens tomorrow, the system would collapse, right? There's a run on the bank. So the way we protect this with the augmented bonding curve is we give the token two different use cases. So you can redeem the token, you can burn it for your collateral. So selling the token and taking a portion of the collateral. But then as more and more people sell, we actually take an exit tax on every sell. So every time someone sells the token, there's a little bit of funds going into the funding pool. So this kind of serves as a friction. So we don't want people to leave the system. We want people to stay in the system and continue to generate value in whatever way that community does. But if they want to leave, and we understand people have to eat, they've earned these tokens. They now need to sell them so they can buy dinner. Cool. You can sell some tokens or, taking profits. This is like seen as, well, I guess it depends who you're talking to. In DeFi, it's wonderful. In the crypto commons space, profits have a bad word. But what if profits also fed the project? So you you sell some of your tokens, the exit fee contributes to the funding pool. Now, as more and more people sell, there are less and less tokens. So if I'm the last person holding tokens, in a traditional bonding curve, I'm holding the bag, right? I almost get no collateral back when I sell my tokens. But with an augmented bonding curve, the tokens I hold now govern the whole funding pool. So if I'm the last person there, my tokens are also good for casting votes over how the funding pool is spent. So the token has two purposes. You can either redeem it for collateral, or you can use it to govern the funding pool. So now there's kind of a balance of forces. So you have people when the curve is really high, people want to sell and take profits. But when the curve is really low, you can buy a couple of tokens and you can have a lot of governance over this funding pool. And since everyone just exited, the funding pool just filled up. So now there's a reason for people to buy back in, to hold those tokens, to use that funding pool towards what they see beneficial in this community. So there's a sell pressure, but there's an opposing buy pressure. And then there's some volatility between those because the people have different estimations of what this token is worth. So there will always be, people selling, people buying, and that generates a continuous funding from the collateral pool into the funding pool. So you have kind of this different forces acting on the bonding curve system that create some interesting properties, and we're really interested to try it out and see how it works. First of all, in simulation, in CADcad, because we want to plug this in and see where does this system fail, right? What haven't we thought of intuitively? Because these are complex adaptive systems with humans in the loop. So, we don't know the kinds of behaviors that could happen. So we want to run it through agent-based modeling and see how that outcome turns out.
So when I was looking at the CADcad output of augmented bonding curves, and the output of the simulation always changes, and that's because the changes comes from the different volatility and the buy-sell pressure that's opposing and pushing each other. Is that why the outcome is always different?
Right. So we don't have a full CADcad model of the because it's actually quite tricky. You can't just model the bonding curve, because the bonding curve is just kind of an interface. It's a value interface. It really depends what you're putting the bonding curve on. And when you do agent-based modeling, you have to model all sorts of like agent preferences. And of course, no model is perfect. So we're not like predicting what's going to happen by any means, but we can use heuristics and say, okay, Lisa has this amount of sentiment towards the system, and she has this amount of affinity towards these proposals, and based on that sentiment and affinity, she might take actions like buy more tokens or vote with these tokens or complete a work proposal in this system to earn more tokens. So there's a lot of assumptions, but of course we can also run these models through parameter sweeps and Monte Carlo analyses so that we can determine, are we making assumptions that are reasonable in real life, or are these assumptions going to wildly change the outcome of the system? But the first step is really building that model, and that's we haven't had the time and the budget to put together that full model yet, but that's on our roadmap. It's one of the first things we want to do before we launch these systems and say, hey, this is engineered and robust. We want to make sure that it's been put through kind of simulations and testing and parameter sweeps and all that. So that's still to come in our roadmap.
Very good roadmap. Have you guys tried using augmented bonding curves in different projects? Because I know Gibbet is using that. There's also grassroots economics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a number live right now. Fairmint is on mainnet. They're an interesting bonding curve. So, and actually, this goes back to a point you mentioned before. How does revenue or like value produced by this community go back into the bonding curve? So, Fairmint has a great, interesting model where they committed, I believe, 10% of their revenue will be put back into the reserve. So in other words, if you believe in their mission and you buy fares, you now are supporting their mission. They're going to continue doing work, and every year they put 10% of revenue into the reserve. So it's it's almost like a stock buyback. They're pushing up their reserve, which pushes up the value of the token, and early investors can claim back, a part of their costs when they sell their tokens. So you can feed that into the revenue pool. Additionally, you could feed revenue into the funding pool. This is something we've talked about in the common stack as well. If a project needs more funding, and it's, say we put an augmented bonding curve on a community and they produce some software product, and that software product has a subscription model. Great. Subscriptions can just go straight into the funding pool if you want, or subscriptions could go back into the reserve pool, or subscriptions could, the design space is quite wide on all of this. And actually, one of the things we've been working on lately that I can show you a diagram, it's just still pretty work in progress, but we've been working on a generalized bonding curve so that we can identify kind of all these different mechanisms, at least all the ones that we've seen so far. So between Fairmint, Aragon fundraising is also live, grassroots economics, One Hive Gardens, they're working on a bonding curve as well, and each of them have some slightly different mechanisms. They've got the exit tribute or the exit tax. Some have an entry tax. Some have the bond to mint and burn to withdraw mechanisms. Actually, maybe I'll just share my screen with you. There we go. So this is just a lucid chart. This is where we do a lot of our rough diagramming. So we've identified a list of mechanisms here. So you may have heard of the hatch. So this is kind of like the initialization period. We also have like a reverse hatch or a termination period. So if all the community comes together and says, hey, we're over this project, you could have a mechanism like a quit button or an eject button that aggregates all the reserve, all the funding pool, and then splits it evenly among token holders. So that could be another mechanism that we haven't really explored yet. We have the bond to mint, we have the burn to withdraw, which is creating the tokens or destroying the tokens. There's a tap, which is how Aragon fundraising works. So this is basically setting up, think of it like a tap from the reserve pool to the funding pool. So rather than in the common stack example, funds move from the reserve pool to the funding pool through the exit tribute. But in Aragon fundraising, they might say, hey, 5% every month of the reserve pool can go to the funding pool and fund the project. So that's one mechanism. You could also have a reverse tap going from the funding pool to the reserve if you needed to. You could also have revenue flowing into the funding pool or into the reserve pool, like in the Fairmint case. So I'll just show you the diagram here that I've been working on, and it is a little messy, but you can see a couple of the different mechanisms. So like the typical bonding curve diagram. So here's your supply. So you put in DAI into the supply, and you can burn out of that. And what happens then is you have the reserve pool and the funding pool. And this is a little bit overwhelming, but we've got a potential entry fee, which is currently used by One Hive Gardens. We have a potential exit fee, which is in the common stack model. We have the tap going from the reserve to the funding pool. We have a reverse tap going from the funding pool to the reserve pool. So you don't have to have all of these at once. But what we're aiming to do is to have these as almost like a checkbox, like what do you want in your system? I need a tap and an entry fee. Okay, then you can just check, and there's your model. You can run it through a CAD simulation, and you can use these, repeatable smart contracts that are already audited and so on and so forth. So we just basically want to build tools so people don't have to develop this all from scratch. They can use the models that exist, they can use the contracts that exist, and they can build a bonding curve that's suitable to their context. Because a lot of the time, we're seeing a lot of experimentation, but I don't think we've seen a lot of best practices established yet. So this is really trying to flesh out all of the different mechanisms that could be involved. And here we have, so this community produces work, so it uses the funding pool to produce software, for example. Then maybe it licenses that software or sells subscriptions, and revenue from that can go back into the funding pool, or the revenue can go back into the reserve pool, which is the Fairmint model. So we're really experimenting with, how can we define the landscape, the design landscape, so all of these projects that are working on bonding curves can be feeding into a common pool of knowledge and technology that can be useful to multiple other projects in the space that could also benefit from bonding curves in one of these flavors.
This is absolutely beautiful. Would you say that the reserve pool is for amount that is basically collaterals, so that when anyone's taking money out, that's where it comes from, reserve pools, and then funding pool is the project version?
Exactly, yeah.
And these will all be modeled in mathematics instead of modeling in curves, because when we're talking about reserve pool keep increasing and decreasing, then the curve function for all these different amounts, the curve function will keep changing, right? How do you model that?
Exactly. So the idea behind it, and this is a bit, it's not the in-depth mathematics, but what this shows here, the bonding curve invariant, is the mathematical basis for, there's basically an invariant in the bonding curve that says, this law will never be broken. So it's almost like programming in the law of gravity, and we can do engineering because we, at ground level, gravity is effectively constant, right? 9.8. So if gravity was changing every day, we wouldn't be able to build skyscrapers. All of our engineering rests on some invariant. In electrical engineering, and electronics, we can design this because V equals IR. And we know that V always equals IR, and therefore we can design circuits that rest on that invariant. So we can do now electrical engineering, we can do civil engineering because we have F equals MA, V equals IR. So these equations here basically define the invariant of the system, saying that a certain amount of supply will always result in a certain amount of reserve. So this invariant can hold throughout the system, and now we can do token engineering and modeling because we are basically plugging the math into CADcad, and CADcad is running these simulations based on the math. So we're kind of like designing our own physics. It's like token physics, actually, and we can do token engineering off of the token physics. So each of these mechanisms has to be defined mathematically, and they have to be consistent mathematically. So this is where the building blocks need to start from in DeFi as well, is they need to be mathematically formalized so that you can design them so that they can be truly interoperable with each other. Because if you don't do that, I mean, we can just build these components, they're being built, but we don't know, the limitations of them, we don't know where they fall off a cliff and fail. And when we start combining them, we open ourselves up to systemic risk. When like this big house of cards in DeFi, and hopefully all goes well, but there's definitely some danger of one of these components breaking and the whole thing coming down. So the idea behind the mathematics is really building up that rigorous foundation on which the modeling can rest, on which the engineering can rest, and then we can be more certain that at least these systems are designed safely.
I absolutely agree. I call them first principles. And I think first principles,
Yes.
right? And I think first principles are super important in life because first principles are things that are defined not by logic, not by any anti-science people. It just exists. You can be anti-science, you can be anti-vax, you can be anything you want. First principles will always exist. If you fall down, you will fall down to the ground because of gravity. And that is exactly what's lacking in a lot of these systems. Because while it's very good that people are experimenting like crazy, and I love that, they're experimenting with a lot of different models and systems, but they are not robust, they're not sustainable because they're not built upon first principles. But like you mentioned, first principles is very difficult to build because you have to make sure that that's robust enough that you can start editing all the engineering things that's being built on top of it.
Right. Yeah, and the mathematics, I mean, we can't really expect everyone to come and do this, but we also don't do that with anything else we engineer. I don't understand the mathematics behind a combustion engine, but I drive a car every day. I don't understand the mathematics behind PageRank or the internet, but I use it every day. But that doesn't mean there's no complexity there. It means the technology has been abstracted away from the end user, and the system designers and the engineers are able to work on that layer and then just put that into a product that is useful to people. And that's ultimately, I think, what bonding curves will be eventually, and not yet by any means. But once we can stop talking about bonding curves, and they can just be in the product, and the product just talks about the benefits rather than the mathematics and the curves. And we're just so early in this technology that it's like talking about the internet in the 70s or 80s. It was something nerds talked about, and it was neat for them, but no one else really got it or why. But now it's so clear. We've got a smartphone in our pocket and we're connected to all the world's data. But it just wasn't there yet in the 70s or the 80s, and this is, I think, where we're at today with bonding curves.
I think we're at a pretty golden time in the future because this is where everything is being built. Looking at your complex structure, the first thing that came into my mind was how insurance could be used in that model, because
absolutely,
that's like one of the best ways to look at insurance, because right now we keep talking about insurtech, but insurtech is still trying to streamline all these processes, but not actually trying to increase economic value that this insurance system can bring. And we all know that insurance is not exactly the most, it's not really beneficial to everyone. It's just beneficial to the insurer at the top. And that's how a lot of people got rich. But it doesn't contribute. And this system or this entire, using bonding curve as one of the systems, architecture or technological stack, you can really redistribute benefits to everyone in this little insurance ecosystem.
Right. Yeah, it's a perfect tool for mutual pooling. Which is what insurance was back in the day, right? Before there was an insurance company that's like there to make profits and make their shareholders happy, there were 100 farmers or even 10 farmers. And they said, hey, chances are one of our farms is going to burn down this year. Let's all put, 10% of our earnings in a pot, and whoever's farm gets burned down is covered, So this was mutual insurance because there was no one extracting profits from that. It was just people pooling funds and covering each other. Great. Now, as soon as an insurance company comes in, they're selling a product, and their incentive is to sell as much as possible and pay out as little as possible and retain the profits to keep their shareholders happy. Well, this doesn't actually serve the end users of the system, who get thrown around like rag dolls, where the company's basically incentivized to not pay out your claim, compared to a mutual insurance pooling, which could be facilitated through smart contracts and a bonding curve, which could change the game.
Another thing that I was thinking about looking at your model is the bonding curve of almost like investing in a talent, because you have the two pools. So you have the reserve pool that goes to supporting this individual. Then you have the funding pool, so you can be funding stuff like education, college, and these will be very helpful. Then again, we're moving towards a more neoliberal kind of system where we think that government is just bullshit and we're just going to be supporting each other and be helping each other. But that comes from a very altruistic view where everyone is a good person and no one wants to free ride. I guess this is where the system comes very handy because it prevents free riders problem.
Yeah, right. It could be used as a tool to address the free rider problem, and also to, I mean, it's funny, government is losing trust worldwide. And I mean, for good reason. There are some governments out there that are doing really weird things that the people don't agree with. So, I mean, I don't blame them for distrusting government, but the exact opposite, going to extreme individualism isn't the solution either, because if we all just maximize for our individual utility, we're going to take this planet down with us. This is what we've been doing in the whole neoliberal era, is maximize your personal utility and don't care about anyone else, which actually, if you think about like humanity as a meta organism and humans as the cells, if every cell maximizes for itself, that's cancer. Like we are going to destroy our host organism, which we are doing. So it's not government is bad, individualism is the way to go. It's actually trying to figure out some way in between, that our current governments are limited by the political systems that they operate in, which came up with 250 years ago, at the same time when bloodletting was an acceptable medical practice. That's when they came up with these political rules, which we still abide by. And ultimately, politics is signal processing for the human organism. We are giving input into a system which can make decisions on behalf of all of us, which is really important. We're just dealing with completely outdated signal processing systems where you get to put one bit into the system every 4 years. That's just, it doesn't work anymore. So bonding curves and conviction voting as well could serve as, continuous signal processing systems, so that we can have overlapping fractal layers of governance. It doesn't have to be you and the federal government. It could be you and your municipal commons and your bioregional commons, and your local commons and your national commons and your global commons, and they can all be like fractally designed inside each other, because the bonding curve allows for that transfer of tokens, which could represent skin in the game and money. It could also represent governance. It could represent rights access, who gets to make what decisions. We can really lower the barriers, I think, when we introduce tokenization into these systems. So we don't just have these outdated government structures trying to tell us what to do, because by the time they know what to do, that solution is already irrelevant. It's just these hierarchical systems just aren't serving us anymore. So I think these are really important tools for improving the collective sense making of humanity, so that we can address our biggest challenges.
Absolutely agree. And I really like when you mentioned, if each individual just optimizes for himself, then that's just cancer, because it's exactly how cancer works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Have you seen token bonding curves or bonding curves in general being used in NFTs? Because I've been seeing them used mainly in fungible tokens.
Yeah, they're actually, I think it was Billy Rennekamp wrote about the refungible NFT. If you put an NFT on a bonding curve, you can basically like fractionalize. Yeah, there is some interesting stuff. I don't know that there has been too much active development of bonding curves for NFTs. I'd have to take a look. But there's been some interesting stuff like around personal tokens as well. Which I think is similar to what you mentioned, personal skills development and so on. But again, I think that having the separation of collateral pool and a collateral pool or a reserve pool and the funding pool would be a great addition to kind of the early bonding curves that a lot of these systems are built on. So I think there's still some sophistication needed in a lot of these experiments, and that's what we aim to provide at the Common Stack and Block Science CADcad. Building these models that we can say, hey, here's a model of this type of bonding curve. If you want to change some parameters, you can just tweak them in the model and run it and see how it turns out before you engage in smart contracts and audits and all these other things you need to do. Just to bring the space forward into easier ways to scale these solutions.
So before we end, if there is one advice you can give to these economic engineers or token designers, what would be an advice that you would give?
I would say we need much more emphasis on the social side, on the cultural side. We are almost blinded by this tech, and I mean we're all tech heads, so we're really interested in it. That's cool, but the adoption of this tech doesn't just come about because the tech is there, right? You have to build it for community needs, and we've actually heard that from some of our communities. They're like, you guys are talking all theoretical over here, but how is this going to be used? How is this useful to me? And stop talking like features of the technology and start talking benefits for the community. And I think identifying those community use cases and how these tools can be used, what problems are they solving? That's when people are going to start caring about this technology. Other than the fact that it's new and it's neat, what problems does it solve in the real world? So my advice would be to focus on the community, on your community, determine what it is they need, and then build safe tools for them to use to make their lives better.
That would be quite tricky because on one hand, you have two types of projects. You have one project that is using token bonding curves to be building community, and then you have the other type that already has a community and they're building the token bonding curve as just a way to transfer value. So that would be quite tricky if you're going to think community first and you have no community. You just have an idea.
Right. And a lot of the time it's bridge building. Everyone doesn't have to do everything, but the people who are building bonding curves over here need to be talking with the people who will be using bonding curves over here. And the needs of those communities are often quite different. The end users they don't know what bonding curves are. They probably don't want to know what bonding curves are. We shouldn't expect them to know that. So we should be able to build it into a product so that they can use it easily without having to grok, graduate level mathematics and smart contract code. So this is where the bridge needs to come in. And I think like people like you are great at this because it's explaining these concepts, taking it down a few pegs and explaining like why they're useful and how they're useful. And we need a lot more of that in the space, I think.
Thank you. Do you have anything else you want to add?
I think that's good on my end. I'm really excited to see where research and development in this space goes. So yeah, happy to keep in touch and connect you with any of the projects that are working on this stuff, because I think your analysis of these tools is really important as well. Thanks a lot for the chat.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jeff, especially the generalized bonding curve model. I think that's going to be very useful and very, very helpful for all these projects moving forward. Especially it builds the technological stack that is underlying all these different applications and systems innovation that is coming, not just DeFi, but also beyond DeFi. And for all you guys out there, if you're interested in more topics like this, you can sign up to our Patreon for more reports and more deep dive case studies. You can also sign up to our premium Substack to get more details about all of these topics that we have covered. Till then, I'll see you next week. Bye!